Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Into the Bytecode. Today I sat down for a conversation with Simon de la Rouviere. Simon's been around crypto for a long time and is one of the original and creative thinkers in the space who I deeply admire. In this conversation, we started by talking about storytelling and how he thinks about this notion of bottom-up storytelling. We talked about SCP, which is an interesting subculture on the internet. We talked about Jenkins the Valet, cc0, and how NFT economies can be designed to welcome derivative works. And we talked about how more experiments could be run using bonding curves and Harberger taxes in how NFTs are designed from the bottom up. I really enjoyed this conversation, and with that, I'll leave you to it. With Untitled Frontier, you're kind of exploring the medium of building a shared universe. I think the way you framed it was bottom up versus top down storytelling and playing with that spectrum.
Yeah. Why I got into storytelling at all recently was I realized that everything that I've been doing is like I enjoy being creative. So it's like, I've made music, I've done writing, coding is creative. I enjoy being on stage, like I enjoy creativity in all its formats. But I realized even doing a startup, right? Doing a startup is a creative work. So to me, it's like through all these threads of everything that I enjoyed in terms of creativity, I realized you're essentially doing storytelling at the end of the day. It's like when you're on stage, you have to tell a story. When you're building a startup, you have to, through marketing, tell a story about why this matters. If you're writing music, you tell a story about what the listener is supposed to feel. And if you're writing a blog post about something, there has to be a story. Like why are people reading this article? So it's like throughout this, all of it's like storytelling. And I realized, oh, well, maybe I'm just actually a storyteller first and foremost, and I need to hone that craft in different ways. And so getting into fiction storytelling was just a way to continue that exploration in new different ways and seeing how all these threads are put together. Like after I left Consensus, I was at Consensus for 4 years from 2015 to 2019. I took the opportunity to write my first novel. And it was just extremely joyful experience because I found that the process was actually very similar in terms of how I was creating in terms of like crypto economics and token economics, which is you essentially have to sit with this idea in your head the entire time and push it and mold it into different directions and see if it works or not.
How is that happening for you on a day-to-day basis? Because I can imagine that writing a novel can also be a very painful experience for some people.
Yeah, but I enjoy that process. I enjoy the process of feeling lost in the story. And so for me, it's a process of exploration in itself. It's like you're not just exploring the world that you're creating, but you're exploring possible universes, paths and permutations constantly. And that felt like a similar kind of process to thinking about crypto economics. You have to go, but what if someone does this, right? It's like, what if there's a malicious actor doing this? And so in storytelling and writing this novel, it was constantly going, well, why didn't the character just choose to do this? Or like, what if the character decides to do this?
Yeah.
Oh, now that they've done this, it means that character's motivation is going to change. Like they're going to want to do something else based on this behavior. And you also wanted to ensure that characters have agency. You're not just following a plot. So you constantly have to be all the people. That's just a very joyful experience to me because it's this constant process of exploration and pulling from different futures and trying to make sure that there's some narrative that makes sense in a logical process. So on a day-to-day, that was probably it. But I've also learned a lot from writing a novel and how I would do it again in the future. I feel there's this dichotomy that's used in writing, which is called plotters versus pantsers. And plotters define the plot beforehand and then they fill in details. Pantsers are people that they call writing from the seat of their pants, which is just like they wing it, right? They start writing and the characters seem to have a life of their own and they
You're the latter, I imagine.
Bit of both. Like I would go like, this is where it should be headed. And I know there's key plot points that's coming up that I think it's going to matter. Let me just see what the characters are doing along the way and then I change it. But I feel like the reason why that's a bit more difficult to do is just takes longer, right? So you have to be willing to go back and redraft, right? Constantly. Right. So there would be something that you go, say, 3/4 to the book, some characters, it just felt right that the characters would do this, but you go like, well, the only reason why it feels great here is that you have to actually set this up way earlier in the book, which means you have to go rewrite some stuff. And now you go, okay, well, now I'm rewriting this stuff, which means these characters might change their motivations based on the things I have here. So it's, you have to, like, I call it like defragmentation. You remember we used to defrag hard drives? It's like the constant reshuffling process. It's like, okay, go back. It's like a sorting algorithm. Okay, go back. Fix. And so the process takes very, very long if you do it that way. I mean, it took, I was a first-time writer and I did it full time, and it took about a year and a half, year to 8 months or so to write full time to get a published book.
Wow. Yeah, it's very interesting just hearing you describe that, because like, I guess when you're building a product or a startup, there is a similar process in which, like, as you're kind of building it and you're moving forward on this timeline, you have new ideas and your whole sense of like what this thing is, how it should be formulated is kind of like evolving. But you have this like helpful constraint, which is you can't go back and change history. Like the only your degrees of freedom are only like from here going forward. Whereas when you're like writing a story, you can literally be like, okay, I got to go back and like redo this whole thing, which I imagine, especially if you're drawn to, you know, I mean, elegance or like things, the puzzle pieces fitting perfectly together, I imagine it can really like hook into that sense of like being a perfectionist and like really just kind of like have an infinite feedback loop.
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, but that's dangerous. That's why people don't finish stuff. You know, they get hung up on the fact that it has to be perfect, and I try actively to avoid that. It's just when it feels to be 80% done, I go like, publish.
You gotta ship. You gotta have some of that shipping mentality.
You gotta get stuck. But I must say the process of creating was obviously very different to what I was used to before. Like coming from tech, it's like it's acceptable to go, hey, I have a new idea. It takes a weekend to code, or like 2-3 weeks to code, and you publish and see what people think or feel. And like then it's like this very nice feedback loop of like, okay, people are using it, or this sucks, or this is good, and you iterate and improve. Writing a story that takes a year and a half, it's kind of sucks to give people a draft, you know, to go read this, because again, it takes a lot of time, right? It's not like, oh, you can look at a website for 10 minutes and someone can give you feedback. No, it's like you're putting a massive amount of expectation on someone to go, hey, friend, read this thing. It takes 6 hours, 7 hours to read, and it's a draft.
So it becomes a very like lonely solo experience, I imagine.
Yes, it is. It can be. And I mean, it's obviously stuff I thought about coming from a tech space, like how do you improve feedback along the way, and whether it actually matters, right? I'm not even sure it matters, because it's a different thing when you're creating a product for people to use, right? Versus something that you feel you're a creator and you have a story to tell. It feels like it should be more the case that when people create for absorbing a story, whether it's music or art or storytelling, you should stand on your own 2 feet and be confident about what you're doing, and then let other people just interpret that, whether it's good or bad. Obviously, there's ways along the way which you can improve it. I've been reading Creativity Inc. from one of the Pixar founders. Ed Catmull, and how they used to fix stories along the way during production. And they have this thing called the brain trust, which is just like a group of people that they trust to give opinions without ego, right? And it's like, that would be great to have access to that while you're writing a book or a novel that takes a year and a half. But at the end of the day, that's just someone that's a good storyteller. And that might not even be the case. The good storytellers are the people that want to appreciate what you're doing. You know, it might be that you're writing something that's completely different, that doesn't fit the narrative or normal way of storytelling. There's different ways of storytelling. It's the 3-act structure. There's the Kishōtenketsu, is a Chinese-Japanese style narrative storytelling.
How does that one work? How does the
Kishōtenketsu?
Yeah.
Oh, that's interesting.
It's just too cool to not ask. It sounds too cool.
Yeah, strangely enough, one of the most popular posts on my blog is the Kishōtenketsu article, because it's just super like SEO juice for some reason. It's like everyone that Googles Kishōtenketsu somehow finds my blog post about it. But it's an interesting way to do storytelling, which is, it was started from, I might be wrong in remembering this correctly, so apologies if I don't get this correct, but as far as I remember, it was started as a form of Chinese poetry. And then got adopted in the rest of Asia. So the formula is quite interesting. It's a 4-act structure of storytelling, which it's often used in an example where people say it's not the conflict-based storytelling. So a lot of Western-based storytelling is conflict narrative. It's the hero journey that overcomes the internal and external problems, and superhero movies and everything's conflict narrative. Like we have to overcome the hero and all this kind of stuff. Like Kishōtenketsu is usually used as an example for conflictless storytelling. How it works is the 4-act structure, which is there's an introduction, so it just like sets the scene. Then there's some interesting development, something changes. The 3rd act is usually unrelated to the first 2 parts. It's just kind of strange, something completely different. And then the 4th act is sort of what they call the elucidation, why the first 2 acts and the 3rd act is actually relevant to each other. So why it's interesting is the form of storytelling. It's you read it because you want to be surprised. So the final thing is always, oh, that's why the 3rd act is here, and it shows how it relates to the 1st and the 2nd act. So obviously it's quite different, right, to the traditional Western 3-act structure, because it's like the 3rd act is supposed to confuse you. So you want to read it because the 3rd act is going to confuse you.
Yeah.
And then the 4th act will go, here's why these puzzle pieces fit together. It will
resolve it all. Is there a popular example of a story or thing that uses this structure?
So obviously it's used often in poetry. So it's like usually shorter narratives. Longer term, I've yet to read actually longer form Kishōtenketsu, but the classic one is by poet Sanyu Rai, and it goes. The introduction is daughters of Itoya in the Honmachi of Osaka. So it just like goes, okay, here's these daughters, these royal daughters, and then the developments next year it says the elder daughter is 16 and the younger is 14. Okay, so you know now more about these daughters. And now comes the 3rd act, which is completely unrelated. It says, throughout history, the generals killed the enemy with bows and arrows. Okay, well, why does this matter? Why are you saying this? And then the conclusion or the twist why these puzzle pieces matter is like the daughters of Itoya kill with their eyes. You know, so it's like, okay, it's an interesting sort of introduction, development, change, and then there's reconciliation at the end. And so it's like it'd be interesting to see this on a longer form storytelling. But I also think one of the examples in the blog posts that I also use is you can actually do 3-act structures within Kishōtenketsu as well. You know, you start with Act 1, there's the character conflict, Act 2 is rising of the tension, and Act 3 is the resolution and the climax. So just this constant growth narrative of the stakes must keep getting higher. And so I wrote like an example of like a 3-act structure within Kishōtenketsu, which is just a story about a puppy and a boy, which is like the 1st act is a puppy lives with his family. He's young and likes to gnaw on things. And then the development is one day the dog ravishes a corner of a couch and some papers. So now I realize, okay, the dog really likes to chew stuff and whatever. And now the 3rd act is like, what's going on? A boy is stuck in his room. He is crying. So obviously you want to ask him, what's going on? Why is the boy crying? Why is related to the dog story? And then the final reconciliation is the father opens the door and apologizes for grounding the boy. The dog left a paper trail and did indeed eat the boy's homework. So now I understand, oh, the boy is crying because the dad berated the boy, but actually the dog did eat the boy's homework. So, but there is this 3-act tense structure, which is this conflict between the boy and the father. It's just revealed in a different structure than linear start, middle, end. Yeah.
I love that. One question that comes to mind for me is on this theme of top-down versus bottom-up storytelling, right? And if I was to describe, you know, this spectrum, top-down is there's an individual or like, you know, a group, a centralized group who has a particular, you know, is like carrying this torch the way you were while you were writing the story, you were like going through it beginning to end. And bottom up is maybe there's a seed planted and then everyone's kind of left to their own devices to kind of expand on different story arcs and like complement each other, like run into like different circles. And there isn't a kind of centralized cohering force like pulling it all together. So where have you seen this bottom-up storytelling be effective? And I also see parallels to this. This is like one of the open questions in my mind when we talk about, you know, DAOs, for example, right? You know, some people conceive of DAOs as like there is no, or I mean, again, it's on a spectrum and all versions of this exist to different extents, but there's a version of a DAO where there's like no leader, and it's just 1,000 community members who are contributing a little bit where the project aligns with their interests and availability and you know, all their life circumstances. And then, you know, on the other end of the spectrum, it's maybe, you know, a project does have a lead, like maybe does have a benevolent dictator who's like carrying the torch, but they're just kind of enlightened in how they're operating. They're not trying to like keep all the control for themselves, but in a very kind of more intentional way, they like give responsibility to different people, bring them in, and this like opens up over time. So in thinking through this, a part of me feels that the kind of most radical, interesting, potential, you know, things that crypto can give birth to are on this like extreme end of like the bottom up spectrum, right? And the projects I get super excited about, like Loot, like Yearn, how it was started, like even Ethereum to some extent, a part of me yearns for that to be the future that we're building.
Yeah, it's interesting. The way I see bottom up storytelling is, before we could write stuff down, stories were constantly reinterpreted. You know, folk tales, indigenous stories. It's all stories that are open to remixing, being retold. It's the story of the bard in the inn singing songs about something. They didn't own the song. There was constant reinterpretation and remixing happening. So the story existed as sort of spread through the memory of the network, the people, and the wherever the story is. There wasn't an owner of the story. And today online, we do have bottom-up storytelling. It's memes, right? So like people create memes and no one knows actually who created an original meme, right? Or where it started. Sometimes you do, but rarely. Sometimes, or you don't even care, right? You don't care that this person created the original meme or some forth like that. So it's just constant collective storytelling that people have through expressing themselves through GIFs and pictures and modifications and formulas and templates and so forth. So it does happen more so, but part of my exploration, like you're right, with using blockchains is the sort of question of how can we facilitate that, but also then through this process, you know, either cultivate new relationships, but also bring value to people that contribute through this sort of messy organic process, such that it's more than just a social process or a social ritual that people do. And I think the key thing there to make it work on that extreme is to sort of define new structures of relationships. And in this case, it can be new ways of ownership, but it can be something else too that we don't know yet, right? So, you know, when you look at Bitcoin or Ethereum, I think there are DAOs, right? Because totally. Is it decentralized? Yes, there's no one power structure here. It's fairly autonomous. It runs by itself. And yes, it's kind of an organization because we do have a shared goal here by maintaining this ledger for sharing social relationships. So in doing this more explicitly as a you know, besides just playful meme creation, storytelling, like being a kid in a backyard and pretending a branch is a stick, like to formalize this process is what I've been interested in and trying to figure out. And in that article, I wrote more about it. And I think the key thing here is just, again, when I also mentioned earlier, an interest around platforms and protocols is to define like, hey, here are some rules that we can use to create together. And by defining some specific rules, it allows people to explore more. So I can give an example. Before the blockchain, it still exists today, but it's like a project that doesn't use the blockchain is SCP, which stands for
I came across this.
Yeah, it's wonderful. It's Secure, Contain, Protect. It's a collaborative creative writing exercise where the goal is for people in the real world to find these strange anomalies in the real world and then write fiction about them, right? So it's not conspiratorial. It's just like we're enjoying creating.
Though coming across it, I was like, this must have like found its niche amongst like the conspiracy theorists over the last couple of years.
Yeah. Maybe there's some meta narrative here going on, but it's creative fiction, right? So it's like, there's this weird picture that someone took and we're creating some imaginary world around this picture. And the goal of secure contain protect is to log all these anomalies, because we have to secure reality. We have to contain and protect ourselves from these anomalies. But one thing about why it works was the advent of the wiki, right? So the entire thing is structured like wiki pages. So you write a wiki page about your anomaly, and that structure is important because it allows people to think in that form. It's like, oh, you see something weird, this must have a wiki page, right, about this anomaly. So with NFTs, it's like there are options here to create formats and rules for people to go, hey, in this format we can create new kinds of bottom-up based storytelling that allows people to be imaginative. It allows people to earn from their contributions, and gives it enough structure so that it's not just loosey falls apart along the way. You have to have necessary structure to guide people in a certain way. And Loot, like you said, for me is a very good example, because it purposely has like what I would say lower fidelity. So it invites people to imagine, right? So it's like, here's just a bunch of text describing an adventurer's loot bag. Now you go invent whatever this supposed to mean. So that to me is very exciting, because you can now take that, and through the composability of blockchain as a platform and NFTs as a platform, you can expand upon that and potentially earn through your contributions along the way. So it's that tension remains interesting. I think the only reason why we have, say, in the last 100 years ish, 100, 200 years maybe, with the advent of like, protectable IP and all these kind of things, we've seen the more tendency for top-down stories to be the things that succeed. And Disney is the answer, right? You can see that, like, it works.
I also feel like designing a system that allows for bottom-up storytelling or bottom-up building invites a different kind of an attitude from the builder of that project. Like as the, quote unquote founder or the builder, you need to have a much more flexible relationship with what you're putting out into the world. And I feel like it really does benefit from thinking of these things that you're putting out as like projects rather than like companies. Like this is a project that's going to like develop in any number of directions. It doesn't need to be anything, and I'm like really designing it to give autonomy to this like other group of people to like take it in whichever direction is going to happen. And whereas a company is like, no, I have this like vision of like what this is going to become in 10 years time. And this is something that actually Zach from Coordinate said that has really stuck with me, which is, he said, companies are deliberate process, deliberate outcome, whereas DAOs are deliberate process, emergent outcome.
Yeah, but you're absolutely right. Even like the form of the company, again, is like I said before, you have form and structure that usually lends itself to certain kind of behavior. And this is actually something I've been personally struggling with my business, with Untitled Frontier, is that I'm trying to get out of the idea that it should be a tech startup, right? Because that's only because I'm used to tech startups, right? The company is a vessel at the end of the day that is supposed to enable something in the real world, So now, yes, there is legal stuff, tax accounting things based in the US,
which inevitably kind of like anchors you into a form. But
yes, but then sometimes people serve the form rather than using the form for a goal in the real world. So it's like you are constrained by the form itself in order to think. But this is also coming back to the classic. The more I figure out, the more I see that Marshall McLuhan was so correct when he said the medium is the message. It's like, at the end of the day, the medium defines what kind of stories you can tell. Even in business, like the fact that you have a company sort of means that you're thinking about things in a certain way, even though it's not sometimes intentional. So if you say you start with a DAO, you're already enshrining a way of thinking versus you're starting a company. And even starting companies in different countries, like starting a company in Europe, versus starting a company in the US, company in South Africa, you're already starting off from a different starting point of what this is supposed to enable, and trying to get out of that frame of thinking to go like, this is not supposed to be a tech startup. This is just supposed to serve me in doing what I want to do. And maybe it's not the right way at the end of the day. maybe
Right.
there's some
Like those constraints like just limit the design space that you're
Absolutely.
exploring in a very subconscious way. Like even, let's say you're bringing together a group of people to build something. If it's purely going to be on chain, you can just experiment with all sorts of like crazy structures to do that. Like there could be like quadratic funding, there could be like all sorts of crazy stuff.
Yeah.
But as soon as you're, trying to do it within the existing regulatory framework, and you're like, okay, are these contractors? Do I need to give them like 1099 forms? Because that's what, and then you're immediately like screwed.
Yeah, but that's why I enjoy the collaboration, exploration in the blockchain space, because it allows you to get out of those modes of thinking, right?
Yeah.
Because even like the simple question, are these employees or contractors? Like if you set up a split and the sale goes directly in a split, you don't have to give people 1099s.
Right.
So it's
so
like,
maybe it's a feature, not a bug. It's to like push the don't be an intermediary, and that's how you bypass.
Yeah. And it's just also changing your mode of thinking. I think it's something I always struggle with critics of blockchains. Like I think it's necessary for critique and stuff, but I think the difficult thing I always struggle with is like with critics of blockchains is I want to ask them, like, do you not think that having a public ledger is the most interesting thing that are out there? Like, this is so interesting. Like we've never had this on a global scale, like a public ledger, right? Like how can you not think this is interesting? People say, yeah, but it's like a slow computer. Yeah, but that's the point. It's supposed to be just the shared consensus making mechanism with a public ledger that enshrines social relationships and different objects over time. This is so interesting. Like, can't you just see that? I don't know. So that's my biggest frustration. The other critique and stuff is fine. Like I share some of the worries and concerns, but that to me is just like, have an imagination. Sorry, totally. I didn't want to denigrate people, but yeah.
No, I feel the same way. Where do you find inspiration today in terms of projects that are experimenting with this bottom-up emergent storytelling in an interesting way? And I saw you talk about one which I hadn't come across before, which was like Jenkins the Valet.
Jenkins the Valet,
So what are some of these threads that you think it would be worth like me and other people paying attention to?
Yeah. So I think the big factor really in how blockchain-based storytelling or storytelling using blockchains can enable new bottom-up based storytelling is that there's one key thing here that has changed, and it's the ability for people that created derivative works to earn from doing so with more incentives than traditionally. So if Creative Commons is a thing, people write fan fiction, it's a thing. And some fan fiction writers even become successful. They hone their craft there. And even, 50 Shades of Grey was Twilight fan fiction, right? So that incentive loop works, right? It works, but it could be better, because if you are a derivative creator, one, you might not have the rights to actually create the derivative. It's just non-commercial, maybe use. Some cases, you might not even have the rights to use names and things or characters from the original. And then secondly, even if you're allowed non-commercial fan fiction, that's it, right? You can't sell your derivative work, right? So that creates a constraint upon the people creating derivatives. So they're kind of stuck there. Either you approach the original license holders and ask for permission to publish and earn from it. And that's
just like killing the entire long tail of experimentation.
Exactly. Yes, 100%. I mean, there has been examples of like that, like Baoshu. I think the book is called Baoshu, which was basically the fourth book in the Cixin Liu trilogy, three-body problem trilogy. There was a fan fiction book, and they loved it so much they published it as the fourth book. So it's like, fan fiction works sometimes, but the way it helps in NFT-based storytelling is like, if I own the NFT and I create derivative work from this NFT, I would then earn from bringing value to the original collection, right? And I could earn from creating derivative works, which I'm allowed to sell with commercial rights. So the equivalent would be, I'm writing Star Wars fan fiction. I can sell my Star Wars fan fiction, but if the Star Wars fan fiction is successful, it's as if I've had Disney stock, and I also earn from Disney becoming more successful through the fact that I wrote successful or great Star Wars fan fiction. So now,
is that because you would own some of the Disney NFTs beforehand, or because they would kind of close this feedback loop and have a system for kind of rewarding fan fiction creators?
It's just more simpler. Like, let's say Star Wars had the license, had the Creative Commons license that allowed people to write derivatives and sell them, and anyone in the world could buy Disney stock, right?
Yeah.
Totally. Then those incentives would be similar to what you see in NFTs. And Jenkins the Valet is an example where someone bought a Bored Ape, decided, I'm going to invent a story for this Bored Ape, and I'm going to sell derivative works based on this Bored Ape. So what's happening is, if Jenkins the Valet as a project decides this was great, we are done with this project, right? They made money from selling derivative works, but now they have a valuable ape because they imbued value into this specific ape. So they brought value to the entire collection or community of Bored Apes by making this one Bored Ape more valuable. They increased their financial returns by making that one specific Bored Ape more valuable. And they've earned from creating derivative works. So it just basically means if you wish to create derivative works, there are more ways for you to earn now than previously. It doesn't mean you have to participate to that extent, but if you were someone that goes, I would love to create derivative works, but obviously, I have a job. I can only do this over weekends. I would love to write. I think there's a lot of people that go, I'm a huge Star Wars fan. I would love to write a Star Wars story one day. That would make me really happy, to give back to something that meant a lot to me growing up. But I can't. I can if I want to write in Star Wars pictures. Fan fiction story, but that's it. The only way for me to do that on a legitimate scale is to approach Lucasfilm and say, hey, I have an idea for the Star Wars fan fiction story.
Totally.
Good luck getting into those meetings.
And it's the whole stance of these cc0 NFT communities towards derivative works is completely different, right? Like you're welcoming people riffing off of what you're doing. Like with nouns, their whole purpose is to like proliferate the noun meme, right?
But it's so wonderful because it's to me, it's like we're getting best of both worlds here, right? We're not restricting access to content anymore. It's like to say anyone is free to enjoy this, right? Like with Untitled Frontier, all the stories are being published on a Creative Commons, so anyone can read it. I'm even producing narrative audio dramas from it. It's available on podcast, YouTube. You could listen to it anywhere for free.
I listened to the latest one on Spotify.
Awesome, thank you.
Yeah. So
the content is free, but you're still able to earn from this process, right? That's exciting. That's what's new, and that's exciting. So you get abundance of storytellers telling stories, and you're not restricting access to the enjoyment of the stories, but you're earning elsewhere. That's great. I really love that.
Right. Like consumption and distribution is totally free and open, but ownership in that like original meme is limited, is scarce.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But it just basically means that the ownership doesn't come from the distribution of the content anymore. It's you're buying something else. And that model, I mean, it's not going to work for all kinds of stories. I don't think, something like Avengers or Dune is going to suddenly go, hey, we're going to make money only from NFTs, and all the cinema releases is free for anyone to come. We're paying AMC and all the theaters for anyone to just come watch. Who knows? Maybe that experiment needs to happen with a $200 million movie, and we'll see if they make more than 200, like if they make more,
Totally.
But this is why I got into blockchain so many years ago. It's because I saw this as a platform to experiment with creativity. Like I was a creative, and the first thing I saw with Bitcoin was, wow, I actually can get paid for the stuff I'm doing. Because growing up in South Africa, I created video games during high school. I was like, I could never sell these. Right, I didn't have access, like say living in the US did. So for me, like seeing Bitcoin for the first time, I was going, wow, I can code something up, give access to people to earn from selling games without having to go through this sort of difficult process of signing up for access to financial services. And so that was always a promise. Let's do creative stuff with this stuff. Let's enable creativity.
Yeah, and an adjacent question, which is a thread I know you've been pulling on over the years, is how to design these like base layer NFT economies. So like, so that the design kind of encourages participation and is open to new participants while like rewarding people who are early. And you had this post, I forget from how long ago, but it was talking about a model that would combine bonding curves with Harberger. Is that how you say it? I still don't know.
I assume it's
Harberger
Harberger
taxes.
Tax, yeah.
Yeah, it's like one of those words that I've like read a million times, but I still don't know how to say. But it was a model that combined like bonding curves and Harberger taxes that would, you know, just kind of like create more pressure for like liquidity, like less of people kind of like sitting on their NFTs forever and like listing them for these like insane prices.
Yeah.
But reading through that, at least to me, it felt like we haven't nearly explored the design space of what can be done here. Like most NFT projects still do 10,000 like PFPs, and that's that. So I'm curious, what are models that you think people should experiment with?
Yeah, I think I agree with that extent. I think this has been the case in the past few years in the blockchain space. People copy successful models, and that's fine, right? But at some point, it does get uninspiring. Like I don't want to see another 10K PFP project, right? If it's a cool thing, sure, go for it. But there's a lot of uninspired stuff that just copies the model, sells 10,000 NFTs without thinking more on like whether it's the right model or not for that specific execution. It's kind of similar to startup equity. You know, I've always wanted to read why people just say there should be this 1 year cliff and then you earn for 4 years equity. It's like I couldn't find any literature why people decided this is the best way to incentivize employees. Yeah. Anyway,
well, because like the design that has been used over and over again, like has kind of it's a defensible decision to make. Yeah, like you don't need to explain it. Whereas if you're trying to deviate, then you need to like explain your whole reasoning for it.
Yeah, exactly. But so with NFT collections, I 100% agree that there has been not nearly enough exploration around exploring different property rights and economic tools to facilitate NFTs in general. So the one example that you mentioned was bonding curves. So I experiment with that with neoelastics, where you can generate these pieces of like neoplasticism inspired squares. And then there's this bonding curve, so you can always sell it back into the bonding curve. And then another one I did was this artwork is always on sale, which, as it says on the cover, uses Harberger Tax to require people to always post a sell price. And the NFT can always be, it can never be impossible to hold. So, you know, it's obviously likely that in the future, a lot of NFTs will just be lost to time. People lose their keys or people die without being able to transfer these things and so forth. But with this artwork always on sale, it will always be possible to get this NFT over time. Yeah.
Yeah. It's always up for sale.
It's always up for sale. But yes, I generally feel like there's not been enough exploration in terms of what people can do. And yeah, I wish more people just generally explore with it. With Untitled Frontier, for example, we released a collection with each story, and one of the collections with each story is like there's like a 4-week campaign, and anyone can buy one NFT. And after this period is over, then that's it, right? You can't buy new ones. And
like it's just a straight up inflating supply during that 4-week period.
Yes. Yeah. But the only reason why I wanted to do that is because I wanted to create a similar experience to traditional merchandise, right? So if you enjoyed Star Wars, you could buy the lightsaber, and those stuff is only available during the campaign of the film. So it was kind of similar thing. You release a short story, anyone can go buy one. You don't have to go like, oh my God, I have to rush to buy one, and like, oh no, I have to participate in a Dutch auction, and like, God, it's so difficult to get this thing allow lists, like white lists or whatever, like all these kind of like.
It's insane how many projects that I would have loved to be involved with I've missed out on because I just like didn't see the message on Twitter and it was open for like a 2-hour period. Yeah.
And so it's just like, low price, you can buy any amount that you want. If it happens to sell 20,000, then great. You know, if it sells 200, that's also fine. You know, it's just creating the ability for people to buy one when they want to during that sort of campaign period. So that's an experiment still. It works okay. I think it matters that we also experiment with not making NFTs that are super expensive as well.
How do you think about like if you're building a new project from the ground up today, whether it's Untitled Frontier or like someone else, like a friend is working on something new, and you're thinking through how to distribute the ownership layer of this project, right? To like lean into this model. And one of the first forks in the road is, do I do this with like ERC20 tokens, or do I do this with like this with NFTs? And they just kind of create totally different, they're different design spaces, different affordances for the community to come together.
I think NFT still for me is more interesting, especially if it's like distributing ownership in a project. And the reason why is that I think a part of the reason why people participate is, again, coming back to the original point of bottom-up storytelling, is the memes around the things that we do, right? People participate in Dogecoin because it had a funny dog on it, right? That's the only thing that why it's still alive. So the meme matters, right? So why you participate in a specific DAO is also because what it represents to you and what makes you feel, but also how it relates to the relationships you're building with the people in this DAO, right? So again, shared goals, working towards shared goals. The thing why NFTs are more interesting than, say, a liquid ERC20 token is that an NFT also defines your individual membership in this collective. So it is still, let's say nouns is a good example, right? Each noun in the nouns DAO can vote on its treasury. So in that sense, each noun is fungible, technically fungible because you have the same rights, but each noun is unique in its appearance, right? So you feel like this one represents you in this collective, even though your rights are similar to everyone else. And that's great because it makes you connect makes you connect as an individual towards a larger collective. So previously with all the sort of meme-based coins and stuff, it was just, how do I show my individual contribution? And it was only through how many coins you had and maybe other more sort of quote unquote meat space ways, like socially and culturally.
Totally,
and
like tying your ENS name to it and then talking on Twitter or something.
Yeah, stuff like that. But now with an NFT, you go like, this is who I am in this collection and collective. So that's why it's just more interesting to me. And it's probably easier to go from making an NFT fungible, through like you can tokenize the NFT. There's like fractional and a bunch of other ways to make that fungible. If you need it to be fungible, then the other way around. What if Uniswap wanted to do NFTs? It's probably more difficult to go from taking the Uni token and making NFTs from it. It's doable. You can still do it. You can say, let's create NFTs. You need 200 Uni to be staked to the NFT in order to create it. Boom, you're done. But
NFTs also have more, just let you create different types of membership or roles within the community, right? In a way where with the tokens, it's just like a uniform sea of addresses.
I think that's also something that I want to see more of over time, because a lot of the stuff that's now successful as DAOs are probably still going to run into problems in the future, especially around general ownership of capital. Like we know that like if an economy only existed through ownership of capital, then over time you will get monopolies, right? So over time, more people will just buy up this thing and crowd out competition, and then they will be the ones that succeed. So there needs to be more ways to get, how can I say this, distribution of power over some of these systems. And that comes from changing membership roles and giving power. It's the reason why democracies usually have 3 chambers of governance, So in order to distribute that power, there's already like this discontent over the fact that a lot of VCs own, for example, large portions of capital over some of these protocols, and that's detrimental going forward.
So how would you do this? Like, let's say you're nouns DAO and these nouns are selling for, I don't know how much, like 200K or something. And there are people who are contributing to the project. I don't know how they're thinking about this. Like, how do you grow the base here? Like, I guess there are examples of NFTs. Like, I think recently I saw Kevin Rose's Proof Collective are doing PFPs now, which there will be 10,000 of them, whereas there were 1,000 of the original NFTs. And so this is opening it up to a wider base. is that like, I guess that's one model, right? That as your project kind of succeeds, you kind of do new iterations, you kind of like issue new classes of shares, like if we were going to like take the corporation analogy.
Yes, that is one way, but my thinking is more around creating social institutions above and beyond the capital-based institutions. So, um, you know, create a separate quote unquote union or something related to the actual capital institution that is a separate powerful force that can ensure that only capital is not the thing that succeeds here. So it could be something like, there could be prominent noun-based holders that go and say, okay, we are now going to create a new nouns association, right? A global nouns association of these 10 initial nouns holders, because we are invested in the success of this project. But any future members of this association will be voted on not by the nouns holders,
right,
but the association itself. So in that way, then in the future, you can have someone that's in association that is, and hopefully the association remains powerful, that maybe doesn't own a noun that's necessary for it to make decisions for the success of nouns going into the future. So you get different input and the power locus that isn't just the capital itself. But that takes effort, right? And the association might be funded by the nouns DAO, right, initially, but then its modus operandi is to get funding elsewhere. So it's just creating the separate structures of power. And obviously, one other way to do that as well is to experiment with time-based systems. So, for example, in the U.S. government, Supreme Court justice is a lifetime appointment, but a president is voted on every 4 years, right? So if there are different ways in which to give people access to certain kinds of power and roles that is defined by different time lengths, I think that's also a valuable way to combat any kind of power from being dominant.
Yeah.
Not 100% sure what that looks like in practice, but it could be like, hey, like the nouns DAO holders votes on someone that has executive privilege to do some specific stuff for 5 years.
Totally. Yeah, like orthogonal centers of power that aren't based on the capital base. Yeah. That's one of the vectors that's getting conflated in a lot of projects is ownership and decision making. And I feel like they don't need to be the same thing. Like in a company, there's the shareholders, but then there's like the CEO who's like the ultimate decision maker. And it doesn't necessarily mean that they're the largest shareholder of the group. And so these two things being kind of like separated from each other as independent poles, I think is interesting.
You do want to ensure that the people that are decision makers have the correct risk profiles. You don't want like a struggle with the principal agent problem where like someone's making decisions, but they're not bearing the same risks. But ultimately, you do want either locus of power that isn't just the capital. Yeah, whatever that might look like in the future. I'm not actually sure what it will look like, but you do kind of see this in some extent with some of the projects where there's the foundation, there's the DAO, and there's the company that started everything, like Uniswap Labs, the Uniswap's DAO, and then I don't know if there's a foundation, but that kind of like three system structure. It's like the original company corporation that's being hired or funded by the foundation or the DAO, and then the foundation is sort of a champion of both, and the DAO is like a separate decision-making body, like with the Yuga Labs and the ApeCoin DAO, for example. It's like different structures of power here. They're not fooling anyone. It's basically the same entity, but over time, the goal is for that to be separate stuff that was separate powers in the ecosystem.
Yeah. Have you followed the whole ApeCoin development? What are your thoughts on, because that's another model, right, of like NFT base, and then there's an ERC20 token that's introduced later.
I'm bearish on projects that decide to capitalize on their success by making a DAO that just goes, we should fund stuff. It's like I feel like there should be more here than just doing that as a way to get liquidity and or like make more money, print more money from this system. For me, it would have been better if they just went and said, hey, all the apes holders on the different collections, you now have a treasury. Here you go. Instead of going, oh, here's all the NFT holders. You're now going to get a separate coin, right? That gives you now access to over a treasury. It's like,
right.
why are you adding more layers here, right? And I understand why, because it gives liquidity and it, different kinds
well,
of.
They also just convert this potential energy into like kinetic energy in some way, right?
Yeah.
Like they just manifest money out of thin air.
Yeah, but I think it's more, like I said before, I think it's more interesting if like any kind of funding mechanism or DAO mechanism is more constrained towards specific outcomes, instead of just going, hey, people, write proposals and we might give you money. It's like, I don't know, it should be more constrained towards specific stuff. And obviously in the case of ApeCoin, it's like, yeah, we're going to fund stuff that makes Bored Apes more Bored Ape. Just do more projects. Same with Nounstar, right? They're funding stuff which allows people to propagate the Now meme and like build more. They've done physical works, they've done more digital stuff. That it's fine, but I think there's something more interesting here.
Yeah. All right, man. I think maybe let's close here. I feel like I could talk with you for hours.
Oh yeah, for sure. Yeah. No, there's so much to talk about. But yeah, no, been great discussion.
Yeah.